So welcome to our Advent Lectionary study and worship planning. We are glad to have Professor Wrenn with us. Bishop Strickland will be on with us in a little while. He is tending to some other duties right now, but he'll be joining us, especially as it pertains to worship planning. The format will simply be Professor Wrenn will have a bit of time to share some knowledge about the texts and lead us into the texts study. And then eventually Bishop Strickland will come on, share a little bit about worship planning, and then we'll have a time at the end for questions and answers. But please feel free at any time to enter into the chat box or raise a hand and jump in with a question. Is that okay, Professor, to do that as we go? Okay. Some people just want to speak and then we'll do questions. So if you're okay with that, we'll intersperse the questions. But just to give you background, Pastor Wrenn is a candidate at Emory University, instructor of biblical studies at Trinity Lutheran Seminary and Capital University. She is an ordained Lutheran pastor in the ELCA, and her academic interests include the Psalms, biblical emotions, preaching, ethnography, and embodiment. The first part of her ministry was spent serving small town and rural churches in Minnesota. She misses the prairie sunrises. Her husband, Tim Wrenn, is a Lutheran pastor in Marietta, Georgia, where they live with their 2 children and 2 cats. Rachel enjoys cooking, reading, walking, speaking French, and that holy moment in worship when the acolyte lights the candles. So you can learn more about her on her bio site. I'll put that in the link in the chat box. And I believe we also had just a word of greeting from Bishop Strickland in the chat box. So when you get a chance to read that, check it out. And some ideas from Bishop Jim Hazelwood about Christmas ideas. So that's there for you as well. So Professor Wrenn, thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. I appreciate it. Well, thanks for having me. First of all, this is one of my favorite things to do, is talking about using the Bible in a way that gets us excited and gets our people excited as well. So I'm looking forward to this time together with you today and over the next few weeks. As we begin, let us share a word of prayer together. So the Lord be with you.
Also with you.
Let us pray. Oh, that you would tear open the heavens and come down. Oh, that you would tear open the heavens and come down. Oh, that you would tear open the heavens and come down, so that the mountains would quake at your presence. Amen. That was a line from our Isaiah text for today, and we'll be talking about a number of texts, not just the Old Testament texts, but I have a special place in my heart for the way Old Testament texts can lend themselves to preaching and to teaching. So we'll be hearing a fair bit about that today. And I think it's actually a pretty appropriate time to start to talk about some of those things, in part because we are living in such a bizarre time. And I know it doesn't need to be said, but at the same time, I kind of think it needs to be said over and over and over again to acknowledge how strange this time is, and how strange everything else is because of that. Everything feels strange and weird right now. I don't know at your church if you had an Easter celebration this year, or if what that looked like, but what I know deep within my heart without talking to any of you is that it was weird. It was odd. It was bizarre to celebrate Easter in this time. And folks, Advent is going to be the exact same way. It's going to be strange. It's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to even be a bit unfamiliar. And that was actually the starting point that I took for preparing this series on worship and sermon planning for Advent. The title kind of that I'm working with in my mind is Tell Advent Slant. Tell Advent Slant. There's a great poem by American poet Emily Dickinson, and it's called Tell All the Truth, but Tell It Slant. And I'm going to read it here real quick because it's kind of embodying how I think of Advent right now for this year. She writes, tell all the truth, but tell it slant. success in circuit lies. Too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. As lightning to the children eased with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. And you'll of course forgive her the gendered pronoun, this was in the 1800s. But I wonder if Advent must be told slant this year. If dazzling folks with promises of hope and waiting will shine too brightly on eyes that already are tired with hoping and waiting and watching. It's kind of been a year of Advent, and I think our patience has worn thin. So rather than explaining Advent about the hopefulness of it, perhaps lean into the unfamiliarity and the discomfort of it, because folks are already going to be there. Perhaps lean into texts that may not be your first choice or your first option when going to preaching or teaching, because guess what? This year is nobody's first option for anything. So we're all there already. And the nice thing about texts, especially biblical texts that are unfamiliar, is they can give us words and language and frame to articulate the bizarreness of our current reality. And there are plenty of texts in Advent this year that'll help us do that. So that's kind of where I'm coming from today. That's kind of where we're going to lead into. And what we're going to start with is each week I'll pick a couple of texts, one that might be more familiar, one that might be less familiar, and we'll really do a deep dive into those. But we'll start each with a sort of abbreviated Lectio Divina. So I'm going to read the text, and I want you to just let it wash over you. I want you to just let yourself experience it and notice what comes up for you, what words pay attention to or grab you as I'm reading it. And then we'll talk about it a little bit more in detail. But like I do with my students at Trinity Lutheran Seminary, I always say start with the text. So today we'll start with the text. A reading from Isaiah 64. Oh, that you would tear open the heavens and come down, so that the mountains would quake at your presence, as when fire kindles brushwood and fire causes water to boil, to make your name known to your adversaries, so that the nations might tremble at your presence. When you did awesome deeds that we did not expect, you came down. The mountains quaked at your presence. From ages past, no one has heard, no ear has perceived, no eye has seen any God besides you, who works for those who wait for him. You meet those who gladly do right, those who remember you in your ways. But you were angry, and we sinned. Because you hid yourself, we transgressed. We have all become like one who is unclean, and all our righteous deeds are like a filthy cloth. We all fade like a leaf, and our iniquities, like the wind, take us away. There is no one who calls on your name or attempts to take hold of you. For you have hidden your face from us and have delivered us into the hand of our iniquity. Yet, O Lord, you are our Father. We are the clay, and you are our potter. We are all the work of your hand. Do not be exceedingly angry, O Lord, and do not remember iniquity forever. Now, consider We are all your people. This is the word of the Lord. Well, if we had even more time, the first thing I would do would say, what stood out to you? What caught you? What do you think about this text? But we probably need to dive into it a little bit more. So put all those thoughts on hold. We'll have time to talk about them at the end, hopefully. Right now, I want to back up a step and give just a little bit of historical context, very basic stuff that you probably remember from seminary, but just in case you don't or haven't gone to seminary, I wanted to make sure we were all on the same page. The book of Isaiah is a giant book that most scholars believe can be split up into 3 chunks, corresponding to 3 different historical time periods in the life of Israel. Most of you will know, I'm assuming, that Israel had a king for quite a long time, and many stuff happened before they had a king, but we really don't have time for that. These kings would have this sort of dance of blasphemy and idolatry that they would go through over and over again, that God would call them back from and that they would then return to. It had political repercussions because as they danced with idolatry, they also danced with other political bodies and other royal people because they were connected in the ancient times. And so what would happen is they would seek out political help from these large empires, and God's prophets would be saying, I don't think you want to do that. I don't think that's going to end well. Sure enough, it didn't end well. In fact, what it ended in was the destruction of the kingdom of Israel and Judah by these giant empires that they had been courting to a certain extent. When that happened, God's people were sent into exile and for a long time sat there for about 50 years, wondering if God had abandoned them. After 50 years, they were allowed to return home. The book of Isaiah in its 3 chunks corresponds to each of those historical moments. So in first Isaiah, which is the largest chunk, Isaiah 1 through 39, that's the sort of like preemptive stuff, where the kings of Israel are courting these giant empires and God's prophets are saying, I don't think you want to do that. It's not going to end well. The middle chunk, what is called second Isaiah, which is Isaiah 40 to 55, corresponds to the exile period. Corresponds to the point where the prophets could be saying, see, I told you so. It didn't end well, did it? But instead, there's this wonderful message of hope and comfort that embodies that middle Isaiah chunk, or that second Isaiah. Third Isaiah, Isaiah 56 to 66, what we're in now is a time of rebuilding. It's a time not of pandemic, but post-pandemic, if you were to put this in modern terms, where they're trying to figure out what does life look like now that it has changed irrevocably. Tyler Mayfield has this great book. If you haven't bought it, I highly suggest it. It's called Unto Us Our Child is Born, Isaiah, Advent, and Our Jewish Neighbors. He does a really nice job of talking about how we preach and teach Isaiah in Advent without falling into supersessionism, where we assume that the Old Testament was just a precursor to the New Testament, and anybody who believes differently really doesn't have much to say. Spoiler alert, that's the whole Jewish tradition. I don't think we want to be saying that in our sermons. So he says on page 165 that this text comes to a community in need of hope as they rebuild the temple and leadership after the effects of the Babylonian Empire. Do you know of any communities that are in need of hope right now? Just curious. So third Isaiah is actually struggling a little bit with second Isaiah. Remember, second Isaiah is the words of hope and promise. Third Isaiah is the time of rebuilding. And third Isaiah struggles with the promises of comfort because many of those assurances haven't come to fruition. And so it's kind of like, what now? These were beautiful words, God, of what the future would look like. We're in the future. It doesn't look like that. So what now? The date of this text is about 500 years before Jesus, you could say. 500 years before Jesus was born-ish is when we get this third Isaiah text. And it's important to note its genre. It is a prayer. It is not just a biblical text, it is a prayer to God from a people in need of hope. And that means that God's people have been praying this prayer for over 2,600 years. You can offer that to your folks as a gift. Because what's beautiful about this prayer is that it is a bit audacious, but we'll get to that in a little bit. If you look at the broader text, it's actually a dialogue. God starts speaking in chapter 63, the community speaks back, and then God speaks again in chapter 65:1. So this is not just a prayer, it's a dialogue. And if you're doing a Bible study, I would encourage you to read that whole chunk because it's a nice little dialogue to talk about. Another piece of this genre is it is a lament. And if you went to seminary and if you had a Psalms class, that will be a familiar word, a lament. Its technical meaning is really something like a cry of pain and petition to God. A cry of pain and petition, meaning asking for something to God. And the interesting thing about this petition in Isaiah 64 is that it's holding God accountable. I don't know if you noticed that, but there are those points where it says something like, because you hid yourself, we transgressed. So there's this idea in the text that, you know what, God, if we really believe that you're responsible for the care of all creation, it kind of seems like you're not doing such a great job right now. Which is, of course, true and not true. As humans, we have responsibility, right? As humans, we need to take responsibility for what's been going on. But there is also this sense that the Bible testifies to very, very clearly that holding God accountable for things that are not the way we think there should be is valid and is an appropriate thing to do in God's eyes. I'm actually studying anger in the Bible for my dissertation, specifically anger directed at God. Happens very, very rarely in the Bible where you have an individual who is said to feel anger at God. What's fascinating, though, is that every time it happens, God does not rebuke it. God never rebukes someone who is angry at God in the Bible. But it happens pretty rarely. So that's a whole nother, that's essentially my dissertation. So, all right, let's keep going though. I want to talk a little bit about the text itself. We're not going to go through each verse, but there's a couple things I'm going to highlight that may be helpful for preaching or for teaching. The first thing I want to highlight is what you saw me do in our opening prayer for today. That first verse of Isaiah 64 is a powerful refrain. It is a powerful, oh, that you would tear open the heavens and come down so that the mountains would quake at your presence. And if you want to do a sermon on that, just ask people what the mountains are in their lives right now. What is looming over them? What is towering over them? What feels impossible to move out of their way? Tear open the heavens and come down. We'll talk a little bit more. We'll run with that idea a little bit more, but I just wanted to highlight that. It's a powerful, powerful refrain. Verse 6 has this really interesting idea, which could or could not be used in a sermon, depending on how courageous you're feeling. So verse 6 reads, "We have all become like one who is unclean, and all our righteous deeds are like a filthy cloth." So like a filthy cloth in Hebrew reads like this, uchveged edim. Uchveged edim. Now the interesting thing about that word edim, which is translated as filthy, is it is a hapax legomenon, which is a super fun thing to say, and I'll write it in the chat. And if you say it, it makes you sound very, very smart. Hapax legomenon. It simply means that this is a word that appears once in the entire Bible. This is the only place it appears. And so when we translate it, we're making a really big fat guess. We don't actually know what it means. We just have guesses. So a filthy cloth. We know that this is poetry because of the way it is set apart in your Bible. on ancient scripts when they wrote them, when they switched to poetry, they stopped doing that justified line to line, and they did it like you see here, where they would end a line in the middle of a sentence and then abruptly move to the next one, so that you know it's poetry. It's a different genre, it's a different style. And one of the big markers of Hebrew poetry is its parallel nature. The easiest way to think about this is Hebrew poetry does not rhyme sounds, like roses are red, violets are blue, sugar is sweet, and so are you. It rhymes meanings. It rhymes content. So if you look at verse 6, we have all become like one who is unclean, and our righteous deeds are like a filthy cloth. They are rhyming in some way, unclean and filthy cloth. And if you want to get into a big debate with a biblical scholar, you can ask, well, is that a synonymous parallelism, or is it meant to be an antonym, or what? But we're going to ignore all of that for now. We're just going to talk about the fact that it's in relationship with each other. It is parallel in some way. So edim, this hapax legomenon, is parallel to tam'e, which we know means unclean. So there's this idea that all our righteous deeds have become like a filthy cloth. And if you said that to an English person, does that really make a whole lot of sense? It's kind of like, oh, okay, that's sort of gross, a little bit repulsive. Is that what you're getting at here? But nothing else really triggers for us. Because when we think filthy cloth, we think Tide or put it in the washer and make it clean again, right? Pretty simple process. Not so in the Hebrew Bible. In Leviticus chapters 14 to 15, Leviticus chapters 14 to 15, we hear a lot about what filthy cloths do, what effect they have on the environment around them. Because Leviticus 14 to 15 is about people's bodies when they're not functioning the way they're supposed to, and when they could be a danger to the community, both male bodies and female bodies. And what we hear about in that section is when you have a piece of cloth that has been touched by a person whose body is not functioning the way it should and could be a danger to the community, is that cloth becomes unclean. And not just unclean, it becomes infectious. If you, as a whole person, touch that cloth, you have been infected, and are you yourself now unclean? The righteous deeds, tzedakah in the Hebrew Bible, righteous deeds, God talks about these over and over again as supposed to be a light to the people around them. They are supposed to spread holiness around them. And what this text is saying is now, even our righteous deeds infect those around us in a way that is the opposite of what they are supposed to do. I think a little bit about, and this is not a fully thought out thought, but I think a little bit about how when I, as a white person, try to address issues of racism, and I am so steeped in a system and in a culture that tells me that my body, my straight, white, cisgendered body is the ultimate, and that everybody else is other in some way. So that even when I try to address issues of racism, I often end up still doing damage in some way. I think about this as a friend of mine who is a Black scholar at Emory University at our first election in 2016 talked about, you know what, I get so tired of seeing Black Lives Matter signs in the yards of my white neighbors, because all it seems like they're doing is performing not being a racist. I thought, yeah, you know, I think to a certain extent that's kind of right. It's this idea when we have become so infected and polluted ourselves that by the ways that we have been brought up, that even our attempts to do righteous deeds are infectious in some way. And again, that's not a super thought out thought. So if it doesn't make sense to you, don't worry, I'm still kind of working on it. The point though, is this is not a text about some obscure rule that makes no sense to us today. This is a text that is a confession that says we have become so distorted and so twisted that even our most righteous deeds around us are doing more bad than good. And I am aware of the fact that if you were to preach this or teach this, you would have the uncomfortable position about having to preach or teach about bodies, real bodies, and what happens to them. But spoiler alert, everybody you're preaching to has a body, and they might like to hear it talked about, just maybe. It might be uncomfortable too. So here's our text. It's taking us to this place where it's starting to feel super uncomfortable. And then in verse 8, we have this shift. We have this turn, this kind of beautiful, dramatic turn that happens after we have not only confessed to God, but have also kind of held God accountable as well to say, you have hidden your face from us, and so we have sinned. And then in verse 8, there's this and yet, O Lord, you are our Father. You are the potter. There's this image of God as parent and potter. And this is picked up on from earlier in Isaiah 45, where Isaiah speaks again of God as potter and father and mother, this idea of parent, God as parent to us. This does not sound radical to us, because in the beginning of one of our favorite hymns, say it with me, it goes, our. I didn't see many lips moving. I said, say it with me, our. Very good, who art in heaven. It's a familiar image to us. Do you know how often it happens in the Hebrew Bible that God is called Father to the people of Israel? About 7 times. It is a rare image in the Hebrew Bible. It's in Deuteronomy. It's in the book of Psalms once, a couple times in Jeremiah, and twice in Malachi. And that's it. This was a radical image to assert such an intimate relationship with God. A radical image. But it's the one that the people use to set before God as justification for help. God, you are our parent. You are our potter. You are the one who gave us form as our mother's bodies gave us form in the womb. There's that whole bodies thing again. You can't preach the Old Testament without talking about bodies. And then we get to verse 9 and we see the effect of talking about being clay. So saying we are clay accomplishes 2 things. First, it acknowledges that God is God and we are not. God is God and we are dirt, or as sweet Sunday school student said, God is God and we are but dust, because he heard his pastor say, you are but dust and to dust you shall return. I kind of like that. So God is God, we are not. Second, it places an argument before God that we've talked about already in this. You are God and we are not, so it is up to you to form all of this stuff that is going on around us. It is holding God accountable. Tyler Mayfield from the book Unto Us a Child is Born says, the petition in Isaiah 64 is for God to appear, to right the wrongs, to act again in the lives of a desolate community. And there's something about this holding God accountable that could be really powerful this Advent. Lament, as I talked about earlier, is a cry of pain and a petition. We're going to talk about a little bit about how preaching lament is an incredibly faithful thing to do and might be just what folks need in Advent. You could kind of think about it as telling Advent slant through Isaiah. So you could use that beginning verse as a refrain, a sentence that kind of keeps repeating this and building on it and building on it. Oh yeah, Bishop, should I save worship and preaching ideas till later? Should keep going? Okay. So I could imagine a sermon that sort of repeats this sentence and comes at it sideways, that builds on this refrain so that it is offered like a gift to people, so that it becomes their refrain. It becomes their prayer as they go throughout the week. Offer them these words as we move into who knows what. after election season, as we move into who knows what with this pandemic. Oh, that you would tear open the heavens and come down. If you're a poetic sort or a dramatic sort, I can imagine a sermon that is completely addressed to God, that invites people into it as a dialogue with God, so that it would not just be proclamation to your people, but proclamation on behalf of the people. You, God, who feels so far away, so high and lofty and inaccessible, as we watch the world around us crumble in shame, come down, Lord Jesus. If that's not Advent, I don't know what is. So if you don't think of yourself as a poet, this strategy may be more of a stretch, although I might challenge you to do it. Some of the most poetic people I know are farmers. And you listen to them talk about the land and talk about their machines and talk about their faith, and it's very moving. So, oh, that you would tear open the heavens and come down. But I also think another sermon or Bible study angle could be preaching lament as praise. Walter Brueggemann in the 90s wrote about reclaiming lament, that churches needed to reclaim this position before God of crying out in pain, of crying out in petition. And he was right. But I think what's happened since him is that people have been juxtaposing lament and praise as two opposite ends of a spectrum, as two poles that we kind of stagger between. And I want to problematize that today. And I'm going to do that through the book of Psalms, but I'll come back to Isaiah. So the book of Psalms. What does the name Psalm mean? It's not Hebrew. It's Greek. It's a Greek word that means songs, essentially. So they are denoting the Psalms as something that were meant to be sung or musically performed in some way. That is not the Hebrew title for the book of Psalms. The Hebrew title for the book of Psalms, I'll put it in the chat, is this. Tehillim. Everyone repeat after me. Tehillim. Good. Tehillim. Tehillim is the title for the book that is still used in Jewish Bibles today. And it does not mean songs. It means praises. Praises. Over a third of the songs in the book of Tehillim are laments. And they are titled as praise. Laments means cries of pain, shouts to God that this stinks and you're doing nothing about it. And it is titled as praise. When you speak this lament out loud, either to your congregation or with your congregation, it strums a chord that has been echoing across the creation for millennia. It is a trill of hope, a key of pain, a cry at once both beautiful and wretched that is considered praise. It's lifting up before the saints and before God the simultaneous bleakness and beauty of this thing that we call life. And if that doesn't describe where we are right now, I'm not sure what does. Preach lament as praise. That when we bring our cries to God and somehow God receives them as praise. Invite your congregation into that this Advent. So, two options now. That's the sum total of what I was going to talk about with Isaiah. And I have some thoughts on Mark. But it feels a little abrupt to shift gears completely. Do you want to shift gears, or do you want to take a few minutes and sort of process through this Isaiah thing together? Bishop, do you have wisdom on that?
Suggestion is go ahead and talk about Mark, just so we get to Mark and we don't lose that. And then maybe leave time for people to ask questions after you finish talking through the gospel. At the very end, I just have a couple of suggestions about how we can do things for people's home worship and in worship, whether it's physical or on Zoom, to talk about how lament moves us to hope and how you can let that build over the 4-week season of Advent. I have a poem and a couple of song suggestions that I'll add at the very end. But Rachel, I think for the good use of people's time and yours and the preparation you put into this, I would say push ahead with Mark.
Okay. Let's keep going. All right, this is going to feel in some ways like something totally different, in some ways kind of a similar genre, but let's move to Mark. We are going to do a bit of Mark 13, and it's long, and what I want to do is read it. Okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you a little bit of a context of it, and then I'll read a bit of it to get us kind of oriented, and then we'll talk about it. So Mark 13 is often Advent 1, and it is one of those texts that preachers open to and are like, oh, seriously? Why is this Advent 1? What is it doing in Advent? Because it's from the book of Mark when Jesus is about to start the Passion. This is the final moment before Jesus's Passion story begins. And it is this text, which to our modern ears is so bizarre and so strange, and especially at the beginning of Advent. So Jesus comes out of the temple and his disciples say, look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings. And Jesus makes the prediction that not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down. Because of that prediction, scholars have mostly understood the book of Mark as referring to the destruction of the temple and the persecution of Christians and Jews that came after that. That historical understanding of the book of Mark has colored the way we read this chapter, and in a certain sense has kind of just checked it off the list. Like, oh, okay, so this is a historical moment that it's referring to, and so I can just sort of do check. It probably doesn't have much to say to me today. And this is confession. This is how I've mostly understood the book of Mark, or the chapter of Mark 13. So if it's not where you're coming from, don't worry about it. But I think that when we assign historical meaning to text, it kind of bleeds it of anything else that it might offer us today. Because what happens is it goes into this really strange monologue by Jesus of saying, beware that no one leads you astray. Kingdom will rise against kingdom. This is but the beginning of the birth pangs. This is starting to feel a little too relevant to today. As for yourselves, beware, they will hand you over to councils. No, pastors, they're not talking about church councils. Don't go there in your sermons. So then it talks about the desolating sacrilege being set up where it ought not to be, and that those in Judea must flee. Woe to those who are pregnant. If anyone looks at you at that time and says, look, here is the Messiah, do not believe it. False messiahs and false prophets will appear, but be alert, keep awake. In those days, after that suffering, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will be falling from heaven, the powers in the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. But about that day or hour, no one knows. Neither the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Beware, keep alert, keep awake. And then we say the word of the Lord. And our people say, oh, I was really just hoping for jingle bells. So how do we read this text? And what in the world is it doing in Advent 1? Well, a couple possibilities. We can read it, as I said before, as addressing a historical moment. We know the temple fell. We know that there was great suffering for both Christians and Jews after it. It's possible that Mark, or whoever authored Mark, either knew about that or had already lived through it, and so was writing a sort of encoded message in the gospel to the people of his time. It has also been read as referring to the eschaton, to the end of time, to the moment where who knows what will happen, but there's plenty of opinions out there about what's going to be like at the very end of time. If you want to talk fun, do a Bible study on dispensationalism with your folks. That's an interesting topic. It's essentially the idea, or you can study all the ways that people have said this time is the end of time. Oh no, I was mistaken. This one is really the end of, no, still not there yet. But you can also read it as serving a literary function in the book of Mark. So when you read the book of Mark from beginning to end, and you don't just sort of pull out chapter 13, you notice something about chapter 13 and about what comes after it. So we should know this is what's called the apocalyptic genre. An apocalyptic genre does not necessarily mean referring to the end of time. It's a specific genre of literature in the Bible which sets present suffering in cosmic scope. Okay? Apocalyptic genre sets present suffering in cosmic scope and uses that to understand what is happening right now. When we recognize this text as apocalyptic genre, and then we add that to what happens after it, we find something fascinating. In Mark 13, there are a very large number of words and phrases in Mark 13 that are repeated in the Passion narrative. So the temple's destroyed is talked about, the temple destroyed in chapter 13. That's mentioned again at Jesus's trial in chapter 14. The Messiah is mentioned here. Jesus is accused of being the Messiah in chapter 14. He says, beware, they will hand you over to councils. Jesus is handed over to a council in chapter 14. He says, beware that you do not come into a trial in chapter 13. He warns the disciples again in chapter 14 of coming into the time of trial. And then he goes on trial later on in chapter 14. He talks about betrayal in chapter 13. He is betrayed in chapter 14. He talks about false things in chapter 13. People give false testimony against him in chapter 14. He talks about darkness. He pulls this text from Joel about darkness. And what do you think happens at his death in the book of Mark? Darkness comes over the whole land until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He quotes this text of the Son of Man in chapter 13. He quotes it again in chapter 14 at his trial, coming on the clouds of heaven. And then he says, keep awake, keep awake, keep awake. It's repeated over and over through chapter 13. And what do you think he says to his disciples when he is at Gethsemane? Keep awake, keep awake, keep awake. This text is framing Jesus's death in apocalyptic terms. This text is making the claim that the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ is the moment when the Son of Man comes with clouds on heaven. Daniel Yankich says that the death of Jesus in the book of Mark has an eschatological character. In this gospel, the death of Jesus marks the end of an age. This is the moment. Mark is trying to say this is not just a special death. This is not just Jesus forgiving the whole world. This is the end of time. At least this time, that after this time, everything is different. Everything is changed. And what is so fascinating about that for Advent is that that means that it is in death that the Messiah comes. It is in the hour of despair, paradoxically, in the book of Mark, that the Son of Man comes with power and glory on the clouds of heaven. This text is so brilliant for the first Sunday of Advent, because what it says is it does what Roman or Renaissance paintings used to do. If you look at Renaissance paintings of nativity scenes, you always see a cross in there somewhere. Or there's this moment, there's this little symbol of pain or suffering that's somewhere in the picture. It's saying, no, no, this is not the moment to be looking for, but look ahead, look ahead, look ahead. It might be too grating on people to hear about baby Jesus coming in sweetness and glory and tender lily white skin, which of course we know is not true, but it might be what they need. But it might also help some of your folks to look ahead, to use Mark to frame this moment with the baby Jesus, to look ahead to the hour when the Son of Man comes in power and glory in death. And what sort of hope does that offer for people who may be living in that moment right now? So I want to, I think might be good now to shift to some worship and preaching possibilities. Does that sound okay, Bishop? Or this is briefer. You can tell that I was an Old Testament scholar, much less than a New Testament scholar, but.
No, I can't speak for the rest of the group, but I think this has been really rich, Rachel. Just really, really rich. For me personally, I mean, I don't get to do lectionary studies weekly like I used to, and I really miss this. So just super, super rich. Is there background noise? Because I have another meeting going on, or am I okay? Let me move this. Sorry, I got triple booked today, and I'm trying to do 3 things at once. So Rachel, one of the things that that you and I talked about is this growing sense of hope that is built in the lectionary themes for this year. And Mark's gospel can sometimes be a least favorite of some, and for others it can be a real beauty to preach on, because for Mark everything's in a hurry, and for Mark everything's immediately, and for Mark he's all about pointing people to the cross as quickly as possible. In your tear open the heavens and come down, often, and I'm sure all of you who have been attuned to anybody's life other than your own the past 9 months, and maybe in your own life, you've heard people who said, you know, literally, God, why is this happening? When can life come back to any sort of normalcy? And can we have some hope? I think if anything this year, friends, we point people to hope. But you can't point people to hope without giving them an opportunity to lament what's lost. So one of the things I think we can do in worship is that we can do that in our preaching, we can do that in our praying, we can do that in our singing. But I think Advent this year offers us to tell it with a slant, to worship with a slant, to sing with a slant. So that means the regular rubrics that we have for worship, how we gather, how we hear the word, if we share the meal, and how we're sent forth for service, it's all got to look different. It's got to be slanted because our lives have been so different. If anything, we may equate with those who were in exile in Isaiah's time of what it means to be the people who are just really in need of some hope. I wonder for this first Sunday of Advent, whether you're on Zoom, whether you're doing hybrid, you're in the parking lot, you're in person, whatever it is you're doing, I wonder if there's an opportunity to build either a wall of lament, much like the Wailing Wall in Israel. I wonder if there's an opportunity to either physically give people the opportunity to nail their laments to the wall, to Post-it note their laments to the wall, or if you're on Zoom, maybe you offer people an opportunity to do that in their home. Or you offer an opportunity for people to write that in a journal, or you offer that as an opportunity for people to yell or scream or cry that, or whatever it is you do, but offer an opportunity for public lament and private lament. We as Lutherans do not lament well. We rush through our grief, we rush through lament, and especially speaking for Caucasian people, we are taught that grief is a 3-day process and then you move on? Well, friends, we're in a global pandemic that has lasted longer than 3 days, and our grief is growing. Racial injustice in our country is longer than 3 days. The economic crisis is longer than 3 days. The political uncertainty is longer than 3 days. And so how do we keep pointing people to hope? We got to lament first, but we can't stay in our lament. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to offer one little tidbit that's nice too about that in Hebrew. In the Bible, the word for a cry is both the same. You use that same word for cry of joy or shout of despair. It's rina. You know, if you were to write it, it'd be like R-I-N-A-H or something like that. Rina. It's the same word, and you can only tell from the context if it's a cry of joy or a shout of despair.
And if you look at the Old and New Testament, anytime people are in need of hope, they're also reminded that it's okay to live in that sense of despair. That every time an angel comes or a disciple or Jesus, the words they say are, do not fear, do not be afraid. In other words, you need not fear. You need not be afraid. You are not alone. But they're not saying it's not okay to feel the way you're feeling.
Yeah.
It's okay not to be okay is what the angel's saying. It's okay not to be okay is what Jesus is reminding us, but it's not okay to stay there. So we have to offer a space for lament and then provide a season of hope. I think we do that, friends, also by how we start our worship and how we start the season of Advent. So what does it look like to start the season of Advent? And we offer a growing expectation. So what I think about is that hymn, Come Thou Long Expected Jesus. The first verse is this: Come Thou Long Expected Jesus, born to set thy people free. From our fears and sins release us. Let us find our rest in thee. Israel's strength and consolation, hope of all the earth thou art. Dear desire of every nation, joy of every longing heart.
Would you
What is
sing it? Would you sing it, Bishop? You're so good at singing. Would you sing it?
I'm not sure how good I am over Zoom, but sure. Come thou long expected Jesus, born to set thy people free. From our fears and sins release us. Let us find our rest in thee. Israel's strength and consolation, hope of all the earth thou art. Dear desire of every nation, joy of every longing heart. So listen to that last phrase, joy of every longing heart. What does it mean to offer someone from the very beginning of that worship service? What if you start with an opportunity for lament, but not the we're going to stay that way type of thing? So what if you do that in a creative way, whether that's drawing that out on a painting that grows through the season, or a wailing wall, or whatever. And maybe at the end of Advent, whatever it is you create becomes part of the worship experience for however you're choosing to do Christmas. Or maybe it leads through the season of light with Epiphany, whatever that looks like. And one of the things I think could be helpful is, what if you offer an opportunity for people to be still, to sit in an opportunity of prayer and silence and listening? And so what if that Isaiah reading, that first Sunday of Advent, instead of reading it at the normal kind of in the reading section of the Word, what if you read that as a way to open worship? What if you broke up those 9 verses, and throughout those verses, you either sang Come Thou Long Expected Jesus, or you did this. And Michael, can I share my screen? Am I able to? Yeah. Are you able to see any of that? So take a listen to this. Maybe John Bell is a way that you also tie this into the Isaiah text. It's John Bell, Come, O Lord, and Set Us Free. And it's one of those really easy pieces that you can add, and it's easier for people to sing. And if people aren't with you physically, they can sing it at home. But it's come, O Lord, and set us free. Give your people peace. And then it just continues. Come, O Lord, and set us free. Give your people peace. What if you had that sung in the background and then another voice on top of that? Oh, that you would tear open the heavens and come down.
Mhm.
Come, O Lord, and set us free. And then when that ends, you offer people an opportunity to just publicly lament. We lament that over 1 million people as of today have died of COVID-19. We lament that in this country, 216,000 people have died of COVID-19. We lament all of what we have lost as a people this year. We lament how we've treated our neighbor. And so you've created a confession, but you've done it in the season of lament with tying in the word. It also gets people more embedded into the Hebrew text, which often we don't. We skip by it. We don't preach it. We're too afraid of it, and then you can do that in a way that still reminds people to keep awake. Keeping awake in Mark was not about not sleeping. It was about being alert to the world and the kingdom at hand. And so for Mark's gospel, keep awake literally was to be alert, be on guard, not be defensive, but be on guard. And so what does it mean to be on guard, to be alert for the kingdom at hand?
Another way to talk about that too is to be on watch.
Yeah, exactly. It's almost like if you've ever sat in the hospital and you're waiting for the person to wake up after surgery, it's that anticipation of what is about to happen, or the birth of the child. The other thing I wanted to share with you is, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Jan Richardson. She's one of my favorite poets, but Advent is also an opportunity to invite poetry in. So Rachel shared beginning of poetry at the beginning of this. There's a book that Jan wrote, and it's called Through the Advent Door, Entering a Contemplative Christmas. And she has a poem written for every Sunday of Advent. Now, some of your folks are not going to get into poetry. Some of you may not get into poetry. Jan Richardson may be too much for some of you and some of your folks. That's fine. Know your context. But I wanted to share this first piece of Jan, Blessing the House of the Heart. If you could see how this blessing shimmers inside you, you would never wonder whether there will be light enough, time enough, room enough for you. If you could see the way this blessing has inscribed itself on every wall of your heart, writing its shining line across every doorway, tracing the edge of every window and table and hall, if you could see this, you would never question where home is or whether it has a welcome for you. This blessing wishes to give you a glimpse. It will not tell you it has been waiting. It will not tell you it has been keeping watch. It will not want you to know just how long it has been holding this quiet vigil for you. It simply wants you to see what it is, wants you to know what it knows, how this blessing already blazes in you, illuminating every corner of your broken and beautiful heart.
Oh.
People need a blessing. People need to lament, and people need a blessing. What I would suggest for the season of Advent, especially for you who plan worship, you who preach, you who sing, less is more, friends. Every single one of you are over functioning, vulnerable masses of availability to your people. Less is more during Advent. Bless the space between you and your people, as John O'Donohue would say. Offer an opportunity for that lament that leads to hope. Do that with music. Do that with simple reading. And then when I say less is more, maybe that means that for the season of Advent, you only read the Hebrew text in the gospel. Maybe you don't do the psalm or the epistle. And maybe you allow more space in the worship for more music that can be prayer, like John Bell's. Or more, maybe you meditate on a hymn from long ago, Come Thou Long Expected Jesus. Or maybe you offer an opportunity for people to lament through testimony. And so what I would also suggest is Advent's also an opportunity like Lent. Offer people the resources to talk about how they're through their lament, they have seen signs of hope, and do a 2 to 3 minute opportunity for a testimonial from one of your members. Cue them up on how to do that. Give them the space and the freedom to do that. Let them know it's 2 to 3 minutes, and they can do that either Zoom or in person. But offer them that opportunity of using Isaiah text each Sunday as their framing. And I think that you'll give your people a gift. If you've not invited people in your congregation to do this before, giving people who don't have the opportunity to speak that voice of their faith or their hurt or their pain and how they've been transfixed through that pain to have hope. Sometimes the preacher can share it, but often when congregation members can be the preacher, it can be a much more powerful voice. So the other thing I wanted to say is, how can you end the service by sending people out from lament into hope with an expectation even more each week? So maybe for your sending, instead of just go in peace, serve the Lord, or go in peace, keep watch, or whatever it is, maybe your sending is actually a commission to find hope in the world that week. Maybe your sending is a commission to tear open the heavens and pray that God come down. Maybe you evoke a commission upon the people that leads them out into doing that. And then in the following week, maybe you ask, how did that go? How did you live through that commission this week? The other thing that I wanted to add lastly was this. Allow children and youth to be part of this process. Allow them to tell how they've had a hurt or a pain and how they found hope. Allow them to talk about how they wait earnestly for a better world, a better day, and let them share that. Let them share that lament. I put in the chat box, we're offering on November 15th from 3 to 5 p.m. Some folks from East Tennessee who participate in Luther Ridge's Create in Me Arts and Faith Retreat are going to be offering a 2-hour session that's intergenerational on creating crafts and different type of prayer opportunities that are hands-on for Advent. Maybe some of those things are things that people could do. They build upon one another each week. We're physiological people and we can't really be together right now. So maybe if we can't physically be together, we can at least do something together by a craft that maybe is sent to nursing homes or to our shut-ins or whatever. And maybe it's tear open the heavens and come down. Maybe it's a craft on that. Maybe it's a craft on how it leads us to hope. Or maybe it's one of the things that are mentioned here in the chat box. But I want to stop there. We have a few minutes left and see if there are questions about what Rachel has said, given the preaching and the slant of Advent, the text, or any ideas maybe you all have already started to think about on worship. So there's a few of you. Just go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question. Devin, go ahead.
So first of all, thank you, Bishop, and thank you, Rachel. I've got a couple of pages of notes, and this was extremely helpful. But I particularly like the image relating the Isaiah text to the pandemic. But as you were talking, obviously the text is in 3rd Isaiah, but I would say where we are is in the world, in terms of the pandemic at least, we're still in 2nd Isaiah, right? We're pre-vaccine, you know, we don't even know when we're going to get back to the normal world and find it isn't normal anymore. So I feel like the world is in 2nd Isaiah and our text is in 3rd Isaiah. Can you maybe help me with that image a little bit and maybe making a bridge to that?
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right, Pastor. And I think what I would suggest is hold on to the exile image for Advent too, because then we get Isaiah 40, which is in 2nd Advent. So I don't know that I would go straight to the exile idea. I might hold on to that for 2nd Isaiah in Advent too. But I think you're right. I think the thing that could be helpful in some ways is that this pandemic has affected different parts of the country so differently, and some are fully in exile and some are in 1st Isaiah, and you know, some might even be all over the place. So I think if you really want to lean into the exile, wait until Advent too, but I think that there's still kind of this idea of lament. I liked how you said, Bishop Kevin, that lament leads to hope. I think you could even make it a little bit more stronger and say lament provokes hope. I think there's something about the lamenting thing that catapults us a little further in hope. And you could even talk about that as creating the space. Once you get the lament out of you, there is space inside of you, and what fills that space with the Holy Spirit coming into us and perhaps filling us with hope. Does that help, Pastor Devin? I don't know if that was exactly what you were looking for.
I think so. I mean, I it's all a work in progress, but yeah, it's always helpful to remember there's always another Sunday, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. You don't have to do it all this Sunday. I've got more up my sleeve, so we don't have to do it all this Sunday.
Other questions or comments?
Yeah, I wanted to ask about, you had mentioned the same word in the Hebrew Bible, cry, is used for both joy and lament.
Yeah.
Just tell me a little more about that.
Yeah, so I just put it in the chat. That's a transliteration of it. So of course it wouldn't look like that. Rina. So there's a psalm, which is escaping me right now, but it's talking about, it's a royal psalm. So it's one that pictures God as royalty, and it talks about, shout before the Lord as the Lord comes in. Rina. That's a cry of exclamation, a cry of welcome, a cry of, exalting God. Rina, the same word, is used in the book of Ezra. And oh my gosh, if you want Ezra is so good for our time period. You want to talk about a book that is in our time period, Ezra is fantastic. Just do the first 6 chapters with your folks. That's all you need. But Ezra is the moment where they're coming back from exile and they have to rebuild. They have to rebuild not only the temple, they have to rebuild the city, they have to rebuild the city wall, they have to rebuild everything. And they lay the foundation for the temple. And as they lay it, they've got this incredible ceremony where they have the priests, the Levites, everybody in their vestments, they've got cymbals. And as they lay that foundation, the people say, or the priests say, "Oh, give thanks unto the Lord, for he is good and his mercy endures forever." And it says the people gave a cry, a great shout of joy. Well, they didn't say that, but it's not the word for cry, it's not the rina word, but it's that they exclaimed in joy. And then it says, but some of the old people, those who had seen the first temple on its foundation, they rinad, so that you could not distinguish the sound of the joyful shout from the sound of the people's weeping. It's this sort of gorgeous intertwining, and it's the same word as in the psalm that talks about the rina, to welcome God, and the rina of the people in despair and just pain as they remember what was and what could have been. You've moved on my screen there, Pastor Matt, does that help a little bit?
Yeah, that's really powerful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank
Oh,
you.
it's one of my favorites.
We're actually over time, but we're going to be gathering the next 3 Wednesdays at 9 a.m. Eastern. I would encourage you that if there are other folks you know of in your congregation, or other pastors and deacons and such who you think might find this incredibly useful, please encourage them. They can still sign up. And I would also encourage you, if you have other questions as you've ruminated on these types of things, bring those questions back next week. And we'll be doing that. As we continue to think through things, I'll offer up a couple of worship suggestions each week. And hopefully my sound and video and all that kind of jazz will be working better. The one thing I wanted to share with you is I put in the chat box also Pray, Praise, and Give Thanks, a book by Gail Ramshaw. And she has in there a lot of laments that are based on mostly the Psalms. But I would encourage you to look at that. There's also some table prayers in there, Eucharistic prayers, and water prayers. So keep those in mind if you're looking for something to add to your worship service. I also wanted you to do this if you don't have this as a practice. Pray the prayer of the day every day during the week as you're writing the sermon for each of the weeks. There's a reason why the prayers of the day are written the way they are, and some of them come from collects that date back over 1,200 years. So for instance, the one we pray for this Advent, this very first phrase has actually been prayed for almost 1,500 years. So I wanted to end with this, if that's okay with you, Professor Wrenn.
Of course.
The Lord be with you. Stir up your power, Lord Christ, and come. By your merciful protection, awaken us to the threatening dangers of our sins, and keep us blameless until the coming of your new day. For you live and reign with the Father and the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. I don't know what God is stirring up in you, or what God will stir up even more after hearing what Professor Wrenn has beautifully shared with us today. But be open to where the Holy Spirit will work in you, because she will amaze you beyond your wildest imaginations. So, Rachel, what a beauty, what a joy to listen to your wisdom. Really, really appreciate you offering your time with this, especially as a new professor at Trinity Seminary this semester. What a gift you're giving to us. So we'll be back each Wednesday, and this is recorded, so Pastor Michael will share this. But thank you all for joining us, and God bless you this week. Bye.